Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this very important webinar in recognition of Ageism Awareness Day 2024. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the various lands on which we meet. There are many international visitors to this webinar as well. For us in the Every Age Counts campaign, we very strongly recognise the importance of engaging with Aboriginal people and organisations, and are very honoured to have Graham Aitken of Aboriginal Community Services on our steering committee. And we look forward to doing much more work in this area in the years ahead. I want to thank, if I could as well, the Australian Association of Gerontology for helping us put this webinar on. It's a great organisation, and I commend it to you for those who are interested in joining. And we thank Matthew Jones of the Australian Association of Gerontology for his expert work on the technical aspects of this webinar. Now, before I go further, I want to just deal with a number of housekeeping rules and issues. The first thing is to say that during the presentation, please type your questions in the Q&A box. Please don't use the chat box for the questions. The questions will later be directed to the speakers in the Q&A session at the end, and obviously we'll try and get to as many of your questions as we can. The second thing to say is that if you do have any technical issues, and we hope not, then you can deal with those through the chat box, and Matthew Jones will try and fix them for you. And thirdly and finally, to remind you, this session will be recorded, and we'll be back in communication with you about getting access to that recording and access to the slides. So a warm welcome to you all from right across this wide brown land and internationally. And I want now, if I could, to introduce our three absolutely fabulous speakers. I think you've had some background about them already, so I won't repeat that, and I'll be a little bit spontaneous if I can. And firstly, introduce Ashton Applewhite, then Jane Caro, and then Robert Fitzgerald, and then I'll throw to Ashton, who will then speak to us first. Well, in talking about Ashton Applewhite, you've got to start here, I think. This absolutely fabulous book called This Chair Rocks. It set the world on fire. It really did. Ashton is a larger-than-life personality, someone who's coming in to us today from New York, where she lives. She's had the ear of the United Nations. She's been prominent in the New York Times in so many areas of public policy debate, not only in the United States, but around the world on ageism issues. And can I tell you that if you ever want to get pumped up for a speech on ageism, you've got to have a look at Ashton's TED Talk, which you can easily find online, but it's an absolutely inspirational cracker of a talk. Our second speaker will be Jane Caro. Jane has got an incredible long list of life engagements, living life to the fullest. An author, a columnist, a novelist, a broadcaster, a documentary maker, a professional speaker, a social commentator, who began her career in an advertising agency in that hothouse environment for 25 years, and then went on to do a whole lot of other things as well. I've got to say, my personal view is that Jane is a woman of enormous courage, prepared to tackle a lot of hard issues and to really speak her mind with the objective of trying to build a better world. And then we have Robert Fitzgerald, who I've been privileged to know as a friend and a colleague for a very long time. Robert has spent a great deal of his life in support of the not-for-profit movement in this country, and held many important roles within government as an assistant ombudsman and roles at the state level. But he's now, of course, Australia's Age Discrimination Commissioner, and takes his place as a member of that collegiate team of human rights commissioners. I think it's important to mention he's also been a productivity commissioner as well, and therefore he brings to this role that he has now some very important economic experience, which I think is going to help the campaign against ageism a great deal, because ageism isn't just dumb public policy, it's bad economics as well. So with those few words of introduction, can I now turn to Ashton and invite her to talk to us? Ashton Applewhite, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Robert. It is a pleasure to be here and to celebrate Ageism Awareness Day. Happy day. I want to start with a shout out to two collaborators on this event, my fellow panelist, Robert Fitzgerald, who has just been introduced, and Dr. Marlene Krasovitsky, who is with us but not visible, who is with the World Health Organization's global campaign to combat ageism. And on September 25th, they addressed Australia's National Press Club. And the title of their presentation was Why Australia Needs Ageism Awareness Day. And I'm going to quote Dr. Krasovitsky, who said, "Ageism is pervasive. It is all around us in big structural ways, like discrimination in the workplace and widespread elder abuse, but also in everyday ways, like making older people feel invisible and ignoring and deriding them. And also stereotyping older people in the media and in advertising," unquote. And she and Commissioner Fitzgerald went on to call for the Australian government to recognize and fund National Ageism Awareness Day and do much more as well in the way of education. I met Marlene and Robert when she was the director of EveryAge Counts, the world's first national campaign to end ageism. I had the honor of doing a national tour when the campaign launched in November 2019. So I've seen a lot of your beautiful country and feel incredibly fortunate to have done so. And 2 years later, trailblazing again, EveryAge Counts created Ageism Awareness Day. And 2 years after that, the American Society on Aging got behind it. And this year, Help Age International and many other groups around the world are launching their own Ageism Awareness Day initiatives. Why does this matter so much? Because all change starts with awareness. Most bias is unconscious, and we can't challenge something that we don't even know is in us and around us. And because it shows that a few determined Aussies can change the world. I forgot to check if it's offensive to call you all Aussies, but I'm an American, so I apologize if it is. So I just salute you for that. And it's so exciting because social change is slow and it's hard, and ageism is everywhere. So it is really important to acknowledge that Ageism Awareness Day is solid evidence that we are making real progress and to celebrate that progress. Some of you may be wondering, I confess I was one of them till I thought about it, why this webinar focuses on ageism in advertising. And the reason is that advertising reflects and shapes our values and behaviors in really important ways, both subliminally and overtly. And we often are not aware of how it does so. The way people are shown in mainstream advertising, or not shown, has a much bigger influence on how other people see them and treat them than most of the rest of us realize. Of course, advertising is just one part of a broader media landscape. We'll get to the rest of it next Ageism Awareness Day. But advertising plays a unique role in conveying social norms. When people see that mainstream ad campaign, they just assume that the message is acceptable, right? That it's been signed off on. It is hard to imagine, but when I was a kid, most women in ads were raving about their home appliances and joyfully serving their husbands. There has been real progress. Dads now change diapers, nappies to you. Same-sex couples shop for home loans. People of color buy soap and soda too. And those things have done a lot to normalize the way the rest of the world sees these other groups that used to be less visible. You might even catch a wheelchair user in the background of that wheelchair or that bar of that supermarket or that bar scene. But where are the older people? If you do see us, you get the impression that the only things we're up to are relaxing, grandparenting, and falling apart. You know what? As people move through life, we don't stop being interested in the things we liked when we were younger. We keep buying those things and doing those things, sometimes more slowly, often better. Whether it's starting a business or helping someone through a hard time or planning an event, it doesn't matter. We keep being who we always were, just older. Unfortunately, one place where you do see older people in advertising is as the butt of not funny jokes, not knowing the difference between clouds and the cloud, failing at jobs we don't want and haven't been trained for, peering dimly over the fence at other people getting on with modern life. Imagine if ads mocked people for being fat or queer or disabled. It would break the internet, as it should. People buy products and services they can and do see themselves using. And again, advertising conveys that message. That's what it's a vehicle for. The industry has yet to represent older people in proportion to our numbers and in all our diversity, right? The longer we live, the more different from one another we become. So the idea that it's some kind of fixed demographic is factually wrong, insulting, and frankly, absurd. And that failing to recognize us and represent us leaves a lot of money on the table. I don't have the data for the US, but for Australia, but in the US, people over age 55 control 70% of all personal wealth. More importantly, that failing on the part of the advertising industry contributes to the marginalization and silencing of millions of older people in Australia and around the world, right? If we don't see people, their well-being and their welfare becomes less of a human right. That is strategically reckless and ethically unacceptable, especially in the world of longer lives we are all lucky enough to inhabit. My fellow panelists are now going to explain how we can do better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashton. Jane, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And as the person on the panel who spent, actually it was 35 years, Robert, for my sins in the creative department of advertising agencies, actually writing the ads, I can attest to the fact that the prejudice against showing older people in conjunction with your product is absolutely deep-seated. One of the questions I have been asked, I've been doing, some radio interviews yesterday and today about Ageism Awareness Day, and one of the questions I get asked is, yes, but if somebody's selling cars, don't they want it to be aspirational? Listen to the bias in that question. In other words, getting older is the opposite of aspirational. Yet, sorry, what happens to you if you don't get older? You're dead. So I'm not sure why that would be aspirational. But this whole idea of aspiring is all about who we see as valuable and who we see as not valuable. And if you think indeed about the extraordinary economy built around particularly older women being told that how they look is intrinsically offensive and that they need to do something about it and spend an enormous amount of money doing something about it. This is the kind of selling that is done on the aspirational level, in that older people are meant to aspire, weirdly, in a kind of reverse, roundabout, backwards way, to being younger. Once upon a time, cultures, and we still have an example of that in Indigenous Australians, there was a sense that to get older was to be venerated, to be someone who had been successful in navigating, the inevitable dangers that accompany us all on this planet that's a rock hurtling through space. We've survived that long. We've learnt things. We've survived blows and slings and arrows and all that kind of thing. And there was an aspirational aspect to actually becoming what Indigenous Australians called elders, which is such a respectful term for people who have lived a long time on the planet. Seniors, I really hate that. I really hate the term seniors. I don't care about being called old. That at least is straightforward. But elders seems like an aspirational term to me, if you want to use the advertising context. But I think there's something else that's going on when people are left out of advertising. I mean, when I started out, women, as Ashton referred to, were still fighting to be seen by advertisers, not looked at, but seen. There's a big difference between looked at and seen. The sorts of stereotypes that Ashton was describing that we see in advertising, if older people appear at all, is an example of how a group are being looked at. So they're being othered by the very way that they are being presented. And that's what stereotyping does. Women have fought to be seen as actual human beings, not objects to be desired or of some kind of servant class. And look, there's still improvements that could be made, but it's a lot better than it was. People of colour fought to be represented in our screens. All groups, LGBTQI people, fought for representation, not just in, big important media like films and the news and all that kind of thing, but advertising. Why? People dismiss advertising, it's trivial, who cares, I don't watch it, I zoom through it. Sure. But I always remember what Australian researcher Hugh Mackay said when he said that actually people claim to hate advertising, but they don't, because advertising is the one thing on our screens, a little less so now that we have a lot of social media, that talks to us directly about our ordinary everyday lives and wants us to do something. In a way, advertising is the chronicler of the ordinary, of the everyday. And when you leave a group out of that, out of the ordinary, out of the everyday, you are excluding them in a really profound way. Yes, we have ads on our screens, for older people. They're usually about funeral plans, how cheerful, or superannuation or cruising for some reason, and, the occasional retirement community. But that's about it. It's got to be very specific, as if older people don't use laundry detergent or buy fruit and vegetables or indeed cars. There's something that goes with that disappearance of them as just normal humans going about normal human life. And I think it has something to do with the loneliness that a lot of older people talk about as being very much part of the experience, the negative experience of getting older. There are positive experiences of getting older as well. But if asked about the negative, often loneliness comes up. And of course, that can be to do with being widowed and losing friends and so on and so forth. But I think it actually has something to do with not seeing yourself represented as just part of the community. No better, no more worse, no more valuable, no less valuable, but as valuable and as unique and individual as each person is. Not just all old ladies are like this, all old blokes are like that. No, we're not. We're as different now as we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Indeed, as Ashton says, we become more different because we grow into ourselves more. We begin to occupy our authentic selves more as we get older. That's the great gift of getting older. So I think it's a profoundly damaging thing. I remember writing an ad many years ago which featured an elderly couple who were still flirting over doing that. Was for a laundry detergent which didn't fade colours. And they were flirting with one another, bantering as they did the washing. And he said to her, "You're still as beautiful as the day I married you." And the end line was, "This laundry detergent, some things never fade." The client freaked out. I'm still proud of that ad. I think it would have sold a bucket load. It was great. The client freaked out. And do you know what his objection was? "I don't want my product associated with old people." Now, I can't imagine a client, even then, we're talking probably 15, 20 years ago, saying out loud, "I don't want my product associated with Black people." But he could say, and could still say out loud, "I don't want it associated with old people." That's appalling. And it's also, and I keep saying this over and over. It infuriates me, actually, that all prejudices, all of them, are stupid. The idea that people differ because of the colour of their skin or their sexual orientation or their social class or their, gender is just, if you think about it for 3 minutes, dumb. But honestly, ageism is the dumbest of the prejudices, because if you're lucky, you will get old. I don't care how young you are now, you will get old. And you know what? Those of us who are already old, I'm 67, can tell you, it happens faster than you ever dreamed possible. It hits you like that. Oh my goodness gracious. I'm suddenly old. I look in the mirror and I think, who the hell's that? Oh, it's me. I don't think, that's not how I see myself in my head. You will get old. So every time you discriminate against an older person, you are literally discriminating against your future self. Now, I'm sorry. Apart from refusing to take action on climate change, which also as a species we appear to be doing, what could be dumber than that? So advertising matters because it says to people, you're part of just the everyday, ordinary world, and your money's as good as anybody else's, and the fact that you buy our product is something we're really pleased about. Not, oh, we don't want a whole lot of old people. I've heard this, I shan't say which media companies, but from media companies saying, yeah, we just want to change the audience, they're all a bit too old. Do not disrespect the people who spend money on your product. That's bloody idiotic. So getting people to understand that old people are just people, like people of colour are just people, women are just people, LGBTQI people are just people. That's the beginning of respect. It's the beginning of inclusion. And it actually changes the way people feel about themselves. Look at how much more confident women are today to stand up for themselves, to fight for their rights, terrifying a lot of people in the world and causing a great deal of difficulty. But all women are doing is saying, no, take us seriously, listen to what our lives are like, and pay attention to what we want and don't want. 50 years ago, women didn't do that. They were scared to. Well, old people, I think, are in that situation to some extent now. Let's listen. It's worth it because it'll be you any minute now.
Thank you, Jane. Can I remind people to put questions in the Q&A if you have any? I'm sure there's going to be quite a lot. Jane, the point you make about invisibility, is also the case at the local community level. Federal Minister for Health, Mark Butler, talks about a woman he knows called Elizabeth, who just doesn't get seen in her local shops.
Yeah.
And, what advertising does, of course, is play up this problem on a grand scale. Thankfully, we've got cross-party cooperation for our work in EveryAge Counts, because we want our politicians to get behind this as well. Robert Fitzgerald, over to you.
Good, thanks, Robert, and it's a great pleasure, great joy to be with Jane and Ashton. When I took over this role just 6 months ago, I was determined to build on the work of my predecessors, Susan Ryan and Kay Patterson. What I learned from Kay in particular was that ageism sits at the heart of many of our public policies in relation to older people. What we also became very clear is the way in which we see the world, the way in which we react to people in the world is shaped by what we read, by what we see, and by what we hear. And it seemed to me and to us in the Commission here that to understand the role of media was critically important because it influences so many other issues. What we decided to do was to do something different, however, in the research. We decided to take an insider story. That is, to do research that talked to journalists, editors, media executives, consultancy groups, and the educators of young journalists in universities. And in a report that we released last week called Shaping Perceptions, this is an insider's view of how the media sees itself reporting on these issues, and it is related to the advertising world. Let me just do a couple of things. The first is the findings, in some sense, about how the media portrays older people in Australia in particular. The first is that the framing of ageing as a problem, as if it can be cured, as if it can be solved, as if it can go away. So ageing is not seen as something to stage in life. It's actually seen as a problem that needs to be resolved. The second, of course, is one that we will understand, the prevailing narrative of decline and frailty and vulnerability. And whilst they absolutely are part of ageing, they're not the dominant path for most of us for most of that time that we are in fact ageing. A third one, which is a growing one in Australia, is intergenerational conflict. And we're starting to see this played out in the media and in workplaces, where the younger generation holds the baby boomers in particular accountable for many of the things they find distressing: housing unaffordability, educational debt, and so on. But it's been exacerbated within the media narrative. As I say, it's the narrative of the streets being adopted. Another is what we really do understand, I think, increasingly is gendered ageism, where particularly for women that are aging, it is very much largely spoken about in terms of beauty and image and so on. And the comparison between an older male and an older female in the same story, which we highlighted in the report, is palpable when you read it. And of course, the last one, which Jane's mentioned and Ashton also, is this notion of invisibility. It's simply the stories that are not run. What was curious about all of that is not those findings in and of themselves, which were the drivers. The first is the media itself believed in some senses it was reflecting the perception of older people in the Australian community. And that's true. The media both represents the community, but also shapes the way in which the community responds. And there was an overwhelming sense that the community in Australia sees older people in the terms that I've just described. A second thing is, of course, ageism is the only ism that is acceptable in Australia. Racism and sexism, as entrenched as they are in individuals and parts of the community, we would say are unacceptable. That is not true with ageism. There's a tacit acceptance that ageism is okay. And that's also reflected within the media's own views. But the third area of findings was even more significant, is some of the reasons for this. It was a lack of access to subject matter experts, but I suspect that's simply because the journalists and the media weren't looking for those experts. It was the time constraints. In other words, the stories were being prepared in very short times, and they were effectively adapting or adopting, as I say, the language of the streets in those sorts of stories. But most importantly, there was a lack of experienced and older people in the media industry. The media industry is completely skewed to young people. And what they identified is the conversations around older people, ageism, mentoring by older media experts is simply not present. And so younger journalists and younger editors were simply adopting what they've heard around and about, rather than being in any way educated, either by mentors or in a formal educational system, about these particular issues. And so in many senses, the drivers of the narrative that appear in the media is in fact partly because of the media structure itself. And I'm sure, as Jane said, that would be true in advertising. So going forward, we have to start to address some of those issues, which we can talk about a little bit later. The most important, I think, finding from the media, however, is something we've also observed generally. When confronted with the fact that somebody is ageist, there is a willingness, in fact, to change. Ageism, as you know, the Australian Human Rights Commission every single day fights against racism and fights against sexism. And as I indicated, they are deeply entrenched. In the workshops that we were doing, that were started by Kay, looking at ageism in the workplace, we discovered that many people are surprised that their views, the way in which they talk about, the way in which they respond to older people, is in fact offensive and ageist. But the better finding is that they're willing to change. So part of what we now know for sure and certain is ageism is different from sexism, is different from racism, if we can have that dialogue and what we really call that self-discovery. And I think the same thing applies in media and perhaps, Jane, in advertising. That if people were really conscious of the fact that what they are doing is in fact ageist, is inappropriate in the way in which we represent, talk about, treat older people, change is possible. The darker side of that is that we don't change now. By the time we get 20 years on, when 9 million Australians will be over 65, 2 million will be over 85 years of age, ageism might be entrenched in the same way that sexism and racism is today. So there is an urgent challenge to change the landscape. My last comment is that this report really shows us one thing, and that is we want people in the media and in advertising to value older people for who they are today, not to value people like me who is old for what I've done or who I will become, but actually value me for who I am today and what I contribute to society today as a 68-year-old man, not as what I've done when I was 40 and not what I'll be like when I'm 85. So that's the big challenge. It's to respect people as they are in this moment, in this day. The media has an important role in shaping society, but it also has an important role in shaping itself in order that, in fact, ageism is no longer such a predominant aspect of the media in Australia. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you very much, Robert. And could I also add that Robert is a great champion of an international convention to protect the rights of older people, and we welcome his role in that going forwards. The first question I'm going to direct to Ashton, and it's about something that I think she has some strong views on. It's a question about what about the anti-aging industry and the pharmaceutical and medical industries that are involved in all this? Perhaps it's not just the advertisements that are ageist, but the products themselves. You know, it's really the premise that old is ugly or old is sick, some kind of disease to be cured. I think you might have a view on that, Ashton. What do you say?
Well, what gave it away? Yes, as you were talking, I thought of a fantasy where, I mean, aging is living, right? To live is to age is to live. And I just imagine, I'm not sure what there is in Australia, but in the US, the Surgeon General's office has big stickers on cigarettes and some other projects. Smoking is dangerous to your health. Wouldn't it be fantastic if they said on anything anti-aging, it is dangerous to your health, because buckets of evidence now show that attitudes towards aging affect how long you live, how well you feel, how your mind and body function at the cellular level. Now, we're not there yet. We live in a culture that is not ageist, but capitalist. That's not news to any of you. And a capitalist culture frames aging as a problem to be fixed or cured, air quotes there for anyone who isn't looking, around cure and fix, because then they can pitch us remedies, right? It's a problem and we can be persuaded to buy things to fix it or cure it or stop it. Jane referenced older women being told that the way we look is intrinsically offensive. Younger women too, right? Women are never the right age in the workforce. We never look right. No matter how thin and how blonde and how young you are, there's always room for improvement. Younger women now are starting to get preventive Botox so that you start freezing your face before, God forbid, wrinkles start to emerge. I'm not a doctor. There certainly are age-related conditions that require treatment, but another thing that happens in this culture is that normal hormonal changes, physical changes are pathologized. Oh my God, you can't let that happen. Of course, aging is not a problem to be fixed or a disease to be cured. It is the one universal human experience. It is a powerful, beautiful, lifelong journey that starts the day we're born. There's a really interesting trend, progressive trend in gerontology. No one wants to go into gerontology because all those old people. Well, it's actually the study, a life course approach of how we change as we move through life. So this is a little bit meta, but if advertisers saw aging not as something sad and sick that old people do, but as shaping, as an opportunity to shape the way we think about the way we move through life, the decisions as consumers and as parents and as insurance buyers that affect our trajectory across the lifespan, I think that would be really powerful, because there's a lot of a million ways to sell things that don't capitalize on our insecurities. That's a potent way to do it, but it's unethical and bad for us. And there are so many more opportunities to do all the things that advertising can do to to educate us and teach us about each other.
Can I just add something quickly to that, Robert?
Sure.
It's really interesting to me how advertisers often seem to think that people are very static. That whole point about that we're all aging since from the minute we're born, and in fact we're moving through life as a kind of journey, is something they don't get. I've had people say to me, oh, as I said in what I said before, you know, we need to get a younger audience. And I always say to them, you will get a younger audience, just in about 10 or 15 years' time. People grow into, for example, drinking wine. You don't want to be drinking the same thing at 45 that you were drinking at 25. You want to be maturing and changing, and your tastes become broader and different. And there's nothing wrong with catering for that increase in sophistication that often follows having gone through life and tried many things. But people never, they really segment markets so rigidly. I've always disagreed with this, that they forget that the old were young a minute ago, and the young will be old in a minute. So just stick with what you do well, and you'll get them just when they're a bit older.
Thank you, Jane. A question, if I could, to Robert Fitzgerald, and it is this, I'll read it as it's come in. Why do you think, Robert, that the mainstream media has not reported effectively on the Human Rights Commission report, Shaping Perceptions?
Well, there was some media coverage, but from my point of view, this is a long game. What the media itself identified was a couple of things which I think we need to work on. Firstly, there's almost no interaction between the media industry and the peak bodies and advocates for older people, and they want to be connected. In some way or another, that seems a natural fit. I've been an advocate, as you know, in many, many areas of public policy and social policy. In this space, there's a complete disconnect. There's the media there, there's the sector there, and they're not coming together. Secondly, there's actually a real loss of education in the media itself. There's no formal education at all about the issue of ageism anywhere in the media. And the loss of older people in the media means there's not even that casual dialogue, that discussion. And we think that that can be fixed in terms of training and education, but also connectedness. And the third thing is actually the narrative itself. They believe, in a sense, that they're reflecting community's view. And what we've got to do is what Jane and Ashton is saying, is actually say that is not the community's view. It's certainly not the view of older people within the community. So I think the great challenge for the media is everything's about education and all those things, but it's forming ways by which media, particularly young people, particularly young editors, are actually connected into these issues and learn a language that's acceptable. So my view is it's working together with those to narrow the knowledge gap, but also the way in which the narrative is occurring. And I think that is very, very possible. But it's a conscious decision. And if we don't do it, as I said, Australia is an aging Australia. So the question is, what sort of Australia do we want as it ages? That's actually the question. Taking away from the personal issue, this is the big issue for me. We now are 20 years ahead of when we will be an aged Australia. So what we do now will make a difference, not 5 years from now or 10, but 20 years from now.
Thanks, Robert. And Jane, I want to go back to you, and I want to draw on your experience, those 35 years in advertising agencies, to ask you the question, is it a problem that there aren't enough older Australians continue to be employed in advertising? Does that contribute to the current predicament we're in?
Absolutely, it does. And it's quite stark. Something like the percentage of people in advertising who are over 50 and 55 absolutely collapses. It's seen as a young person's game, and that's a shame. And like a lot of businesses, it's also a stupid policy, because so much corporate knowledge is contained in people who've worked in an industry or in a particular organisation for a long time. And yet it is often de rigueur, particularly if new management come in, to just get rid of all the older people. And I think there's two things going on there. One is oh, well, they're too old anyway, they're past it, it's not a good look for the clients. But the other is maybe they know too much. Maybe one of the things that younger management coming in don't want to hear is when they come up with their bright new idea, oh, yes, we tried that before. And yes, I know it's infuriating to young people to hear that. It was to me when I was young. But there is a truth to it. And if we could just drop our bias against that and in thinking that the world is completely different today than it ever has been before, which I'm afraid it never is. We just keep going round and round, and listened to some of the lessons that have been learnt by others who've been there before us, we might be able to stop being the mice on the wheel, going round and round and making the same bloody mistakes over and over again. And I think that is one of the big problems of ageism for our entire community. We're losing a body of knowledge, a body of experience, both industry specific, but also life knowledge. And we're dismissing it as irrelevant and even perhaps dagging old-fashioned, silly old people, what would they know? But actually, if you listen, you might find they know rather a lot. So yes, there's a huge problem with advertising being seen as, or wanting to see itself. I've always been a bit skeptical that it's nearly as funky and cool as it likes to pretend, but that's the image it wants to convey to its clients and to the world at large. And old people are not seen as funky and cool, though Iris, what's her face, with the big yellow glasses and all the big, there has been yes, that's it, Apfel, Iris Apfel. She has single-handedly transformed how funky you can be as you get older. And that sort of thing breaks down barriers in a way that's gentle and no one knows that it's happening. But her as an example, I think, is hugely important. So yes, we need to keep older people gainfully employed in our community. I don't necessarily mean paid work, but paid work certainly if that's what they want. But I mean gainfully employed in our community in terms of contributing and being respected for that contribution, rather than regarded as a burden or a bother.
Thank you, Jane. And while you're on a roll, there's a follow-up question to you. What do you think of the idea of some kind of prestigious award for positively getting a good track record in the portrayal of older people in advertising?
I was the chair, as it turns out, of the positive portrayal of women in advertising back in the 1990s. And we had a number of award ceremonies where we would actually reward advertisers and agencies and creative people who had portrayed women in a positive light. Now, it was sneered at by the industry, I'm afraid. They were in denial at that time about the way women were portrayed. And at that time, very few women were in senior positions. A very, very similar situation to what we're seeing now with older people. Of course, back then, there weren't many older people either. So that's continued, whereas women have become much more of a real part of the advertising industry these days, running lots of companies and all that kind of thing, which is a great thing to see. But I think it's a good thing to do, but it often has more of an effect on people outside the industry than on the industry itself, which gets defensive. But that's not a bad thing, because all those things, everything we do is cumulative. Nothing is the magic wand, but every positive step forward, including a positive portrayal of older Australians in advertising, for example, if that got up off the ground, adds to the pressure and the feeling that there's momentum behind this and that the change is on the table.
Thanks, Jane. And now Ashton, yes, Robert, please jump in.
The challenge, I think, is not only just about the positive portrayal of ageing, it's the appropriate portrayal of the issues of ageing. So one of the dangers in this space is that many people online who are ageing will recognise that there are vulnerabilities, there are frailties, there are issues both in health terms and so on. one of the great challenges in advertising, but also in terms of just the media, is how do you portray those issues as well in a way that is respectful and important. So in aging, it's a difficult narrative because not all aspects of aging is very positive. There are these elements. So if you're going to have an award for positive aging, the portrayal of aging as positive, there's an even more important award, and that is that can deal with, in a respectful, dignified and appropriate way, those issues that confront people as they age. And I think that's actually the greatest challenge, because in a sense, if we've got this burden, like it's a deficiency, like, it's a terrible burden on the person, a terrible burden on society, which is the portrayal of some of the issues that affect us as we age, that is about the worst way you can portray that issue. But if you can say, yes, of course, people are, there are issues around dementia or cognitive decline or physical mobility decline and so on, but you can do that in a respectful way and a helpful way. I think that's the great challenge in advertising and in the media more generally, as well as those aspects that are absolutely positive in the aging process.
And it comes around to representation. Still, we need, when you brush something into the corners, it doesn't make it better. It stigmatizes the condition. And that's why I see a bunch of comments in the chat about people don't love positive aging. Me neither. We need to acknowledge aging in all its wild diversity, which means facing the scary stuff. And one of the challenges here, and I feel strongly about it, although it's complicated, it's always complicated, is the equation of aging with frailty is false, but there are age-related conditions which mean that more older people use canes, need hearing aids, et cetera, et cetera. We need to represent that. We have learned, I think, to recognize when everyone in the room is white, when everyone in the room is male. We need to bring the same filter. Is everyone the same age? There's never a good reason, hardly ever. Maybe in advertising there is, but not in society as a whole. And we need to also have people with visible disabilities there. You don't know how to represent them? Ask them, because they know.
And what we need to be really aware of, and we've kind of been down this road before, is the problem with benevolent ageism, as well as hostile ageism, because benevolent sexism, for example, is a really clearly understood benevolent racism. And both of those actually do damage while making the person doing it feel good. Well, that's not helpful. And I think what you're talking about there, Robert, is a kind of benevolent ageism in advertising, where it's all about showing older people jumping on trampolines. I'm here to tell you, no woman over 50 should go near a trampoline if she's had children. But I think it's not about that. Positive portrayal is always about you seeing them as a whole person.
Yeah, that's true.
So I want to come back, if I could, to Ashton because of a very useful question that we've been asked by someone who's actually turning 61 today. They tell us, happy birthday. Ashton, the question is, based on the understanding we all have of how we've just grown up being inculcated with ageist values, the questioner asked, how do we support people in midlife and beyond improve their attitude towards themselves? And the questioner makes the point that often people use humour, to put themselves down because they're getting older. And this person says, to end her question, I firmly believe it starts with us. And I'm sure you think there's truth in that. Over to you.
It always starts, all change starts within, all change starts with awareness. You can't force someone to change their attitude, of course, but you can model attitudes about your own age and aging by not buying those cards, by, if you get one of those really offensive birthday cards, say, gee, would you send a card that made a similar joke on the basis of race or sex? The most important thing we all need to do, and we do this continuously because we are all brainwashed, is to interrogate our own attitudes towards age and aging. How do we use the words old and young? How do we see our friends doing this? And when we see someone do something ageist, or we hear something ageist, to say, gee, a really simple intervention is just to say, what do you mean by that? Right? I feel old. What does old feel like? Well, old typically feels, maybe incompetent. Well, did you ever feel incompetent when you were younger? Of course you did, right? You feel so young, you mean you feel with it? Well, did you ever feel that way? We feel all these things along the lifespan. They are not intrinsically linked to an age of life, right? So to ask these questions, there are ways to ask them gently. As far as, rewarding advertisers, it's always better, although less fun and less tempting, to call people in for doing something well than to try to shame people, right? So think about your own language, I just want to mention a website called the Old School Hub, oldschool.info. It contains hundreds of free and carefully vetted resources to educate yourself about ageism in the workforce, in language, etc. And has EveryAge count, has all the campaigns. So the education is there. It's hard. There's so much about aging we can't control, but we can control how much we learn and our own attitudes. That's up to us. It's hard, but it's free and it's doable.
Thanks, Ashton.
Hanging on to my self-deprecation. I've done it all my life. I'm not changing now.
I've got a question here that I think is really intriguing and a bit frightening, really. So I'm going to ask one of you to step up and answer it. Maybe just keep it to one so we can keep the questions going. Here's the question. Believe it or not, we are seeing examples of greedy granny toys.
Yep.
We're seeing kids dressed up as stereotypical older people to mark their first 100 days at school. Some people would say, it's just a bit of fun. Who's going to step up and challenge that?
I'm going to defend it.
Go you.
I'm going to defend it because I don't think that there's anything necessarily wrong with celebrating 100 days of kindergarten by getting dressed up. And I don't think we want to lose completely our sense of humor about and be completely po-faced and no. I think we can do it and encourage our grandchildren to do it respectfully and with a sense of fun. I mean, I watch Bluey with my grandkids and they have Rita and Janet who are the grannies and they play the grannies. I'm really not going to take offense at that. I really am not. I think it's funny, it's sweet. And little children will, if they're going to play their mum and dad, they're going to send them up. You know what I mean? If they're older brothers and sisters, they're going to send them up. I don't think we want to become too, you can't laugh at us. As long as we're in on the joke and we can laugh at ourselves. I mean, maybe the grannies should turn up dressed like their grandchildren, to turn it around. But I'm not. I think we need to be aware of that.
There are so many better alternatives. I just pasted a guide to there's a second one. It's Old School contains 2 guides with other alternatives that are, and the ages, when the kids dress up, they use little walkers and little canes and they're hunched over. And it's very ableist. Also, it reinforces the equation of aging with disability, which doesn't do anyone any favors. I mean, it can be cute, but
it's good to have debate about these things.
I thought they were hilarious when my grandchildren did it, I have to say. Very funny.
A question, Ashton, that follows on to you. It's directed to you. What about social media and the important, consequences of social media and what we see and hear? One platform has intergenerational battles. Some intended to be funny, some not. What do you think about that, Ashton?
Some of them are probably funny. Sorry to sound so sanctimonious, but discrimination isn't funny, and we have better options. Social media is a tool. It can be horrible. I think the effect on young girls is pernicious, all this staring at your face, but there's all kinds of older people on TikTok doing wacky stuff, and older influencers, lots of older women in social media using it as ways to come together. So I think that, it just depends on who's making it and who you choose to follow.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you all so very much. We've reached the end of our question time. I think it's been a really stimulating discussion. I want to just say a number of very important things, though, before we finish. And the first is that EveryAge Counts wants the community and people who care about ageism to be the eyes and ears of ageism in advertising. And if you go to the EveryAge Counts website, you'll see a very comprehensive guide and support for the kinds of issues that you can take up, giving you links to the key websites where you can make a complaint about things, or where you can send a note of congratulations when there's everyday representation of older people in advertising, as we would want there to be. So if you go to the website, you'll see quite a lot of opportunities to be able to follow up that as much as you're able to do. I want to just say that the EveryAge Counts campaign is a campaign that really is very much community-based. We have some 30 local government authorities right around Australia who are backing our work, and we're absolutely certain that's going to grow a whole lot more. We have individuals, many thousands of individual people backing this campaign. And I want to also make the point that this is pretty serious business, in the sense that ageism really does have terrible impacts on so many people. The former Age Discrimination Commissioner Kay Patterson and now Robert Fitzgerald continually remind us of the links between ageism and elder abuse. We know there's so much evidence around about the terrible discrimination that occurs for people in their 50s. It's documented. The stats are in. There's a very high percentage of employers who simply won't employ people over 50. So ageism isn't some trendy issue. It's about a real injustice, and that injustice impacts some groups in the community much worse than others. We know for a fact that older women get this double whammy of discrimination on the basis of age and because of their gender. So I do urge you to support the EveryAge Counts campaign. We're looking at possible sources of future funding. We have some irons in the fire, and we're very optimistic about those. We hope to be able to make some announcements soon. But the great strength of this campaign is the individual people who stand behind it as supporters. So please add your voice by going to the EveryAge Counts website. We are going to get back to you about the recording of the session today with links, and we want you to widely disseminate that information. We'd also love your feedback. You'll see the slide on the screen now that allows you to get back to us. And I think for me, I really want to say that I had an experience as a young Aboriginal legal service lawyer back in the 1970s. And I swear to you, this happened. In the media at the time, there were regular jokes about Aboriginal people, and it portrayed them as stupid. It portrayed them in the most unhumane way, as some other people from some other planet. They were othered, they were disparaged, they were marginalized. That happened. That was actually what was happening in my country. And now, of course, the world has turned, and we've still got a long way to go to address that injustice. But when it comes to ageism, it's something we've all accepted, but it doesn't make it right. And we do have to act on it. We have to convince the powers that be that we do need a national campaign to start to get people really debating and thinking about these issues. And that's what EveryAge Counts is seeking to do. in balance, in moderation, with evidence-based campaigning that will seek to build a non-ageist Australia. So thank you for your support for the webinar today, and I hope you'll get right behind our campaign as we move forward over the years ahead. Thank you very much to our panelists, each and every one of you, and to AAG for your support. Happy Ageism Awareness Day. Let's do it. Thank you.
Thanks.